When looking back to the most iconic films of the 1980s, one of the first franchises to come to mind is Indiana Jones, and many of the archaeologists' most famous adventures were basically theme park attractions waiting to happen. And throughout the late 80s and early 90s, Disney was filled to the brim with some of the most ambitious ideas in theme park history, the majority of which never saw the light of day. So let's explore the lost Indiana Jones attractions, the ones theme park fans have been fantasizing about for decades, but never had the chance to experience themselves. As the 1980s drew to a close, Disney was standing tall after two very successful collaborations with filmmaker George Lucas. Both debuting in 1986, Star Tours and Captain EO had both proven to be incredibly popular with guests to the Disney parks, and both Imagineers and Disney executives were eager to get to work on a new experience based on another of Lucas's creations, Indiana Jones, a franchise that was set to release a third installment in May of 1989. Before Disney even considered beginning the project, employees were sent deep into Disneyland to ask guests what they would expect from an attraction based on the franchise, and many had some very interesting answers.
We'll have to have a snake pit. Right.
Enslaved children.
Once Disney and the Imagineering leads had a good idea of what was expected of an Indiana Jones attraction, the Imagineering team was set to the task of creating a full Indiana Jones themed reimagining of the majority of Disneyland's Adventureland, and the team was instructed to treat this task as a blue sky project, where Imagineers are encouraged to think without limits, ignoring budget, technological limitations, and even the laws of physics if needed. While this may sound ridiculous, this is exactly the way many of Disney's most iconic attractions are created, and the blue sky phase of Imagineering is directly responsible for some of the jaw-dropping moments that guests have come to expect from Disney attractions. However, the proposed retheme to Adventureland is perhaps the best example of Disney Imagineering going just a little overboard even by blue sky standards, and it's likely that Imagineers working on the project were well aware of this fact, but staying true to the no-limits attitude of blue sky Imagineering, they created something a little more ambitious than CEO Michael Eisner was bargaining for, and as he was the man who would ultimately decide which projects lived or died, this posed a problem for the Imagineers who wished to see the Adventureland retheme come to fruition. The Indiana Jones project, collectively named Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition, called for a radical transformation of Adventureland, converting it into an archaeological dig site filled to the brim with excavation equipment and lively interactive animatronics of various site workers. What was even more ambitious was the plan to build one massive show building to house much of the new land, and allow for 4 different attractions to travel through the show building at one time. 2 of these would have been slightly altered versions of existing attractions, with both the Jungle Cruise and the Disneyland Railroad receiving a minor retheme and a major reroute, just to allow them to travel through the show building that would also hold 2 brand new experiences. One being a ride referred to then as only a Jeep attraction that would take guests out of the dig site and through a showcase of Indy's most famous adventures, including his close call with the iconic rolling boulder from Raiders of the Lost Ark. The second, then labeled an ore car attraction on site plans, was a roller coaster that sent riders on rusted minecarts around a volcanic chasm at breakneck speeds, and was planned to be partially indoors with multiple outdoor sections. However, by the time the project was ready to move ahead, Michael Eisner had already fallen in love with another attraction in development at the time, Splash Mountain, and elected to give the green light to that project instead. As an added bonus to the company's bottom line, the estimated cost of Splash Mountain was less than a third of the Lost Expedition's proposed $220 million budget, and for a company that was only just beginning to find its footing again after a rough start to the decade, the choice was simple for Eisner, who felt the project was too ambitious to begin with. Ironically, Splash Mountain ended up blowing through its proposed budget almost immediately, but that is a story for another time. Contrary to popular belief, the story of the Lost Expedition doesn't end in California, as the project was revived just 3 years later in early 1990. You see, Imagineers had fallen in love with both the Jeep and the ore car attraction they had been developing, and they knew the perfect place for both of them, that being Euro Disneyland, which was set to open in April of 1992. This park had very few planned attractions when compared to the previously established Disney theme parks. Even before opening, Euro Disneyland was already facing its fair share of problems, namely the spirited resistance from local residents who were strongly opposed to the park's opening in the first place. Disney execs agreed that many elements of the Lost Expedition would be a perfect fit for Euro Disneyland's Adventureland, and for a brief time between 1991 and early 1992, Imagineers were excited to have the opportunity to bring their ambitious idea to a new theme park, and plans were to bring the Indiana Jones attractions to Disneyland Paris as an expansion to the park 1 year after opening. As can be seen on this very early map to Euro Disneyland, this version of Adventureland was to house a large temple. However, this temple was not for an Indiana Jones themed attraction, but for an enclosed Jungle Cruise inspired ride. Because of the somewhat unpredictable climate in France, where cold weather is relatively common, it was decided that this version of Jungle Cruise would be both indoors and themed to Disney's The Jungle Book. The Disneyland Railroad would pass through the show building and over a wooden bridge, borrowing the idea from the Lost Expedition, and also going through this Jungle Cruise temple would be the Indiana Jones Mine Coaster that would pass over an alligator-infested lake and into the temple. From what I can tell from my research, as well as looking at every reference image I can find, the Indiana Jones Jeep attraction, which was to be located just next to the mine carts, would not have entered the temple at any point and would have operated independently. It's a little sad looking at these early plans now, because when Euro Disneyland opened in 1992, it was with a nearly empty Adventureland that only had a single major attraction on opening day, that being Pirates of the Caribbean, and construction had yet to begin on any of the other planned rides. As is widely known, the opening of Euro Disneyland was a disaster in every sense of the word, quickly losing the company more than $3 billion due to extremely low attendance. Within just 1 month of opening, over 3,000 employees of the newly opened park left their positions at the company due to the terrible working conditions that went hand in hand with the company scrambling to avoid financial ruin. Within just a few months of the grand opening, Disney was in a panic, and the window to save Euro Disneyland was closing, and fast.
We are going to die!
Disney executives knew the best way to increase attendance was to bring more attractions to the theme park, but were already hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate with few viable options. Imagineers were told once again to scrap their plans for the Lost Expedition, as it was still being unofficially called at the time, and along with it the enclosed Jungle Cruise attraction, which was deemed far too expensive. Instead, the planned minecart roller coaster would move forward as a standalone expansion to Adventureland, as it was thought to be the most marketable of the planned attractions, and Euro Disneyland was in desperate need of a true thrill ride. So the minecart attraction resumed development in June of 1992, and Imagineers put together an incredible experience combining elements of both Indiana Jones attractions into one ambitious, action-packed adventure, and rarely seen concept art shows exactly what was planned. The coaster, by this time officially in development under the name of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril, would first take guests through a highly themed queue where several animatronic tigers could be seen ransacking the base camp of Indiana Jones' archaeological dig site. A brief pre-show would announce that Indiana Jones was missing within the ancient ruins up ahead and was in need of a rescue, and fast. Guests would then load into their minecarts, passing under a stone archway where audio would play through headrest speakers, informing the guests they had trespassed on sacred ruins and would not be allowed to leave with their lives. The carts would then rapidly gain speed, sending guests careening through a huge inversion, going under and over a 50-foot tall stone gorilla. The carts would then continue to pick up speed, heading through the beak of an eagle, before finally entering the temple, where they would head over pits of molten lava, similar to the chase in the Temple of Doom. The carts would then slow down and enter a long, dimly lit tunnel deep within the temple ruins. Within the temple, the ride vehicles would briefly come to a stop, where 4,500 gallons of water would be released on either side of the mine carts, flooding the tunnel from either side as the carts would again take off, seemingly just before the flood would overtake the ride vehicles.
Water! 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 Water!
Guests would then continue on and pass an audio animatronic of Indiana Jones, an element originally planned for the Jeep attraction, who would point guests to a safe route out of the temple, and after passing one final animatronic tiger, the ride would come to an exhilarating end, clocking in at just over 2 minutes, a very quick but action-packed experience.
Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
Unfortunately, and that's a word that comes up quite often when covering this subject, Disney executives were not having any of this. By the time Imagineers had finished their full concept for the attraction, it was already January of 1993, and execs wanted the attraction open by summer of the same year, just to bring in new guests to the failing theme park. So it was decided, against the Imagineers' wishes, that the new coaster wouldn't be new at all, and would instead directly copy the layout of a decade-old, off-the-shelf coaster already in use in several other non-Disney parks, the Pinfari TL59. Disney executives felt that what Euro Disneyland needed was not a high-effort immersive experience up to the Disney standard, but instead a simple thrill ride to bring in young guests. And because of this, nearly all elements of the queue and on-ride showpieces were completely scrapped, and what was greenlit was a very simple and very short coaster with no animatronics or narrative.
He chose poorly.
Construction of the coaster was then streamlined and fast-tracked, and the ride was constructed in just 3 months, beginning in March of '93 and ending in early June. The quickly constructed coaster was a far cry from what was originally planned, as instead of taking guests on a grand adventure alongside everyone's favorite archaeologist, Disney had thrown together a very simple and generic attraction that used a track directly lifted from a 10-year-old and previously existing coaster, and had rushed to construct a bland temple ruin that had very little to do with Indiana Jones, which was disappointingly built using artificial stone, as Disney executives had again stepped in and decided that carving real stone would be far too expensive and time-consuming given the company's financial situation.
This is intolerable!
If you think all of this sounds like a recipe for an underwhelming experience, depending on who you had asked on opening day, you would be right. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril debuted on July 30th of 1993 and was immediately polarizing among guests. The attraction was the only true thrill ride in all of Euro Disneyland, and as such was predictably popular with children who just wanted a quick and thrilling coaster, which happened to be the first Disney attraction with an inversion. However, those looking for true Disney theming, or really anything to do with Indiana Jones other than some music and a logo on the ride signage, were left disappointed. The Travel Channel left a particularly scathing review, as like many others, they had expected something more from a company like Disney.
This ride will have you begging for less time after time. 1 minute 45 of thrills that feel like a lifetime when you're on it.
The Temple of Peril also failed to increase attendance at the park by any considerable measure, as while it was a quick and somewhat thrilling ride, it did very little to set itself apart from your average theme park coaster, and many felt the attraction had failed to reach the standards that Disney had become known for. Despite the mediocre reviews, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril often had wait times of upwards of 2.5 hours, although this was almost entirely a result of the ride's extremely low capacity, as each minecart held only 4 guests at a single time. For a brief period after opening, Imagineers considered building a second temple to double the ride's capacity. As can be seen in this concept art, the second temple would have been built partially in the space originally reserved for the Jeep attraction, but again budget constraints prevented a second temple from ever getting off the ground, and because of this the Temple of Peril was left as it was on opening day, as those in charge of Euro Disneyland had already moved on to their next Hail Mary to save the dying resort. Flash forward 7 years to the turn of the millennium, and Imagineers wanted to try something new with the Temple of Peril. By this time, many parkgoers had little interest in the coaster, as a newer and more thrilling experience had opened in Discoveryland, that being Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon, and this ride had succeeded in doing what the Temple of Peril had failed to accomplish, bringing new life to the European resort, and slowly but surely the wildly popular coaster had turned the park around from the brink of bankruptcy. Because they had another, more popular thrill ride available for guests to enjoy in the downtime, Imagineers had the idea to revitalize the Temple of Peril, not through the implementation of many of the incredible ride elements originally planned for the coaster, but by simply making the ride go backwards, and that is exactly what they did.
Then came the suggestion, why not turn the seats around backwards?
We actually strapped an 8mm camera to the back of the existing ride vehicles and filmed the attraction backwards. We could then see what the guests were going to see.
While they were converting the ride to allow for backwards travel, new ride vehicles were constructed to allow for 6 riders per vehicle instead of 4. Imagineers also realized that because the ride wasn't designed for guests to travel backwards, several elements along the track would have to be altered to avoid breaking immersion.
If you were in a movie theater, you'd be watching the screen. If you turned around behind you, you'd be looking straight into the projection room, which is obviously not something you really want to see. So in the same sense, in our attractions, we have ride vehicles that have our guests facing in a certain direction, so we're guiding what they're seeing. However, if the guests turn around and look behind them, then they're obviously going to see something that we don't wish them to see. And that was one of the major challenges, was trying to find a way of hiding and theming all these different lighting rigs, things that the guests shouldn't really see.
The downtime for the update was just 2 months, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril Backwards opened on April 1st of 2000, and no, it wasn't a clever April Fool's joke. The revamped coaster experienced a huge surge in popularity, and because of the increased load capacity, wait times eventually became far more manageable. This small update lasted only 4 years, and in 2004 the trains were returned to their forward-facing position for unknown reasons. For the following 10 years, the ride remained more or less the same, until in January of 2014, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril was shut down for a major refurbishment, in which much of the temple itself was completely rebuilt finally using real stone to give the ride a more authentic feel. While the ride was closed, many speculated that more of the original elements that were long scrapped would finally be worked into the ride. But again, unfortunately and unsurprisingly, this did not happen, and when the ride opened 4 months later, the track layout and ride features remained mostly identical, although the ride's loop had been made slightly larger. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril is a very simple ride with a surprisingly complex history, and for an attraction born out of one of the most ambitious Imagineering ideas of all time, it's a little sad to see what ultimately came of it, even if other elements of the originally planned Lost Expedition can be seen around the world, like the Indiana Jones adventure in Disneyland, which of course was born out of the Jeep attraction. But even so, the amazing and ambitious Lost Expedition never did come together like originally intended, despite the idea carrying over from one continent to another. However, with persistent rumors of an Indiana Jones expansion coming to both Hollywood Studios and Disneyland Paris in the coming years, there's still a chance that Disney may cash in on that fortune and glory that tends to come alongside Indiana Jones. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Also, be sure to check out the Yesterworld podcast, which can be found in the description down below, and we'll see you here next time on Yesterworld.